This is the fourth and final chapter of our story. In this chapter, a man's mind begins to unravel, not with a scream, but with the quiet touch of an old scar. The game shifts, the silence thickens, and a long-buried fear begins to surface. Have you ever felt, just before victory, that surrender might be your only way out? If you're ready for the end, let's begin. The joy of play became a lust for play. The lust for play became a compulsion to play, a frenetic rage, a mania which saturated not only my waking hours, but eventually my sleep too. I could think only in terms of chess, only in chess moves, chess problems. Sometimes I would wake with a damp brow and become aware that a game had unconsciously continued in my sleep. And if I dreamt of persons, it was exclusively in the moves of the bishop, the rook, in the advance and retreat of the knight's move. Even when I was brought before the examining board, I was no longer able to keep my thoughts within the bounds of my responsibilities. I'm inclined to think that I must have expressed myself confusedly at the last sessions, for my judges would glance at one another strangely. Actually, I was merely waiting, while they questioned and deliberated, in my cursed eagerness to be led back to my cell so that I could resume my mad round, to start a fresh game and another and another. Every interruption disturbed me. Even the quarter hour in which the warder cleaned up the room, the 2 minutes in which he served my meals, tortured my feverish impatience. Sometimes the midday meal stood untouched on the tray at evening because the game made me forgetful of food. The only physical sensation that I experienced was a terrible thirst. The fever of this constant thinking and playing must already have manifested itself then. I emptied the bottle in 2 swallows and begged the warder for more, and nevertheless felt my tongue dry in my mouth in the next minute. Finally, my excitement during the games rose. By that time, I did nothing else from morning till night, to such a height that I was no longer able to sit still for a minute. Uninterruptedly, while cogitating on a move, I would walk to and fro, quicker and quicker, to and fro, and the nearer the approach to the decisive moment of the game, the hotter my steps. The lust to win, to victory over myself increased to a sort of rage. I trembled with impatience, for the one chess ego in me was always too slow for the other. One would whip the other forward, and, absurd as this may seem to you, I would call angrily, "Quicker, quicker," or go on, when the one self in me failed to riposte to the other's thrust quickly enough. It goes without saying that I am now fully aware that this state of mind was nothing less than a pathological form of overwrought mind, for which I can find no other name than one not yet known to medical annals: chess poisoning. The time came when this monomania, this obsession, attacked my body as well as my brain. I lost weight, my sleep was restless and disturbed. Upon waking, I had to make great efforts to compel my leaden lids to open. Sometimes I was so weak that when I grasped a glass, I could scarcely raise it to my lips. My hands trembled so. But no sooner did the game begin than a mad power seized me. I rushed up and down, with fists clenched, and I would sometimes hear my own voice as through a reddish fog, shouting hoarsely and angrily at myself, "Check!" or "Mate." How this horrible, indescribable condition reached its crisis is something that I am unable to report. All that I know is that I woke one morning, and the waking was different from usual. My body was no longer a burden, so to speak. I rested softly and easily. A tight, agreeable fatigue, such as I had not known for months, lay on my eyelids. The feeling was so warm and benignant that I couldn't bring myself to open my eyes. For minutes I lay awake and continued to enjoy this heavy soddenness, this tepid reclining in agreeable stupefaction. All at once I seemed to hear voices behind me, living human voices, low, whispering voices that spoke words. And you can't possibly imagine my delight, for months had elapsed, perhaps a year, since I had heard other words than the hard, sharp, evil ones from my judges. "You're dreaming," I said to myself. "You're dreaming. Don't, in any circumstances, open your eyes. Let the dream last, or you'll again see the cursed cell about you. The chair and washstand and the table and the wallpaper with the eternal pattern. You're dreaming. Keep on dreaming." But curiosity held the upper hand. Slowly and carefully, I raised my lids. A miracle. It was a different room in which I found myself. A room wider and more ample than my hotel cell. An unbarred window admitted light freely and permitted a view of trees, green trees swaying in the wind, instead of my bald brick partition. The walls shone white and smooth. Above me, a high white ceiling. I lay in a new and unaccustomed bed, and surely it was no dream. Human voices whispered behind me. In my surprise, I must have made an abrupt, involuntary movement, for at once I heard an approaching step. A woman came softly, a woman with a white headdress, a nurse, a sister. A delighted shudder ran through me. I had seen no woman for a year. I stared at the lovely apparition, and it must have been a glance of wild ecstasy, for she admonished me, "Quiet, don't move." I hung only on her voice, for was not this a person who talked? Was there still somebody on earth who did not interrogate me, torture me? And to top it all, ungraspable wonder, a soft, warm, almost tender woman's voice. I stared hungrily at her mouth, for the year of inferno had made it seem to me impossible that one person might speak kindly to another. She smiled at me. Yes, she smiled. Then there still were people who could smile benevolently. She put a warning finger to her lips and went off noiselessly. But I could not obey her order. I was not yet sated with the miracle. I tried to wrench myself into a sitting posture so as to follow with my eyes this wonder of a human being who was kind. But when I reached out to support my weight on the edge of the bed, something failed me. In place of my right hand, fingers, and wrist, I became aware of something foreign. A thick, large, white cushion. Obviously, a comprehensive bandage. At first, I gaped uncomprehendingly at this bulky object. Then slowly I began to grasp where I was and to reflect on what could have happened to me. They must have injured me, or I had done some damage to my hand myself. The place was a hospital. The physician, an amiable elderly man, turned up at noon. He knew my family and made so genial an allusion to my uncle, the imperial household doctor, as to create the impression that he was well disposed towards me. In the course of conversation, he put all sorts of questions, one of which, in particular, astonished me. Was I a mathematician or a chemist? I answered in the negative. "Strange," he murmured. "In your fever, you cried out such unusual formulas. C3, C4. We could make nothing of it." I asked him what had happened to me. He smiled oddly. "Nothing too serious. An acute irritation of the nerves," and added in a low voice after looking carefully around. "And quite intelligible, of course. Let's see, it was March 13th, wasn't it?" I nodded. "No wonder with that system," he admitted. "You're not the first, but don't worry." The manner of his soothing speech and sympathetic smile convinced me that I was in a safe haven. A couple of days thereafter, the doctor told me, quite of his own accord, what had taken place. The warder had heard shrieks from my cell and thought at first that I was disputing with somebody who had broken in. But no sooner had he shown himself at the door than I made for him, shouted wildly something that sounded like, "Aren't you ever going to move, you rascal, you coward?" grasped at his windpipe, and finally attacked him so ferociously that he had to call for help. Then, when they were dragging me, in my mad rage, for medical examination, I had suddenly broken loose and thrust myself against the window in the corridor, thereby lacerating my hand. See this deep scar. I had been in a sort of brain fever during the first few days in the hospital, but now he found my perceptive faculties quite in order. "To be sure," said he under his voice, "it's just as well that I don't report that higher up, or they may still come and fetch you back there. Depend on me, I'll do my best." Whatever it was that this benevolent doctor told my torturers about me is beyond my knowledge. In any case, he achieved what he sought to achieve: my release. It may be that he declared me irresponsible, or it may be that my importance to the Gestapo had diminished, for Hitler had since occupied Bohemia, thus liquidating the case of Austria. I had merely to sign an undertaking to leave the country within a fortnight, and this period was so filled with the multitude of formalities that now surround a journey: military certificate, police, tax and health certificates, passport, visas, as to leave me no time to brood over the past. Apparently, one's brain is controlled by secret regulatory powers which automatically switch off whatever may annoy or endanger the mind. For every time I wanted to ponder on my imprisonment, the light in my brain seemed to go off. Only after many weeks, indeed only now on this ship, have I plucked up enough courage to pass in review all that I lived through. After all this, you will understand my unbecoming and perhaps strange conduct to your friends. It was only by chance that I was strolling through the smoking room and saw them sitting at the chessboard. My feet seemed rooted where I stood from astonishment and fright, for I had totally forgotten that one can play chess with a real board and real figures, forgotten that two physically separate persons sit opposite each other at this game. Truly, it took me a few minutes before I remembered that what those men were playing was what I had been playing against myself during the months of my helplessness. The cipher code which served me in my worthy exercises was but a substitute, a symbol for these solid figures. My astonishment that this pushing about of pieces on the board was the same as the imaginary fantastics in my mind must have been like that of an astronomer who, after complicated paper calculations as to the existence of a new planet, eventually really sees it in the sky as a clear, white, substantial body. I stared at the board as if magnetized and saw there my setup: knight, rook, king, queen, and pawns, as genuine figures carved out of wood. In order to get the hang of the game, I had voluntarily to transmute it from my abstract realm of numbers and letters into the movable figures. Gradually, I was overcome with curiosity to observe a real contest between two players. Then followed that regrettable and impolite interference of mine with your game. But that mistaken move of your friends was like a stab at my heart. It was pure instinct that made me hold him back. A quite impulsive grasp, like that with which one involuntarily seizes a child leaning over a banister. It was not until afterwards that I became conscious of the impropriety of my intrusiveness. I hastened to assure Dr. B that we were all happy about the incident to which we owed his acquaintance, and that, After what he had confided in me, I would be doubly interested in the opportunity to see him at tomorrow's improvised tournament. Really, you mustn't expect too much. It will be nothing but a test for me, a test whether I'm at all capable of dealing with chess in a normal way, in a game with a real board, with substantial chessmen and a living opponent. For now, I doubt more than ever that those hundreds, they may have been thousands, of games that I played were real games according to the rules, and not merely a sort of dream chess, fever chess, a delirium in which, as always in dreams, one skips intermediate steps. Surely you do not seriously believe that I would measure myself against a champion, that I expect to give tit for tat to the greatest one in the world. What interests and fascinates me is nothing but the posthumous curiosity to discover whether what went on in my cell was chess or madness, whether I was then at the dangerous brink or already beyond it. That's all. Nothing else. At this moment, the gong summoning passengers to dinner was heard. The conversation must have lasted almost 2 hours, for Dr. B had told me his story in much greater detail than that in which I assemble it. I thanked him warmly and took my leave. I had hardly covered the length of the deck when he was alongside me, visibly nervous, saying with something of a stutter, "One thing more. Will you please tell your friends beforehand, so that it should not later seem discourteous, that I will play only one game. The idea is merely to close an old account, a final settlement, not a new beginning. I can't afford to sink back a second time into that passionate play fever that I recall with nothing but horror. And besides, the doctor warned me, expressly warned me. Everyone who has ever succumbed to a mania remains forever in jeopardy. And a sufferer from chess poisoning, even if discharged as cured, had better keep away from a chessboard. You understand, then, only this one experimental game for myself, and no more." We assembled in the smoking room the next day, promptly at the appointed hour, 3 o'clock. Our circle had increased by yet 2 more lovers of the royal game. 2 ship's officers who had obtained special leave from duty to watch the tourney. Czentovic, too, not as on the preceding days, was on time. After the usual choice of colors, there began the memorable game. Of this homo obscurissimus against the celebrated master, I regret that it was played for thoroughly incompetent observers like us, and that its course is as completely lost to the annals of the art of chess as are Beethoven's improvisations to music. True, we tried to piece it together from our collective memory on the following afternoons, but in vain. Very likely, in the passion of the moment, we had allowed our interest to center on the players rather than on the game. For the intellectual contrast between the contestants became physically plastic, according to their manner as the play proceeded. Czentovic, the creature of routine, remained the entire time as immobile as a block, his eyes unalterably fixed on the board. Thinking seemed to cost him almost physical effort that called for extreme concentration on the part of every organ. Dr. B, on the other hand, was completely slack and unconstrained, like the true dilettante, in the best sense of the word, to whom only the play in play, the diletto, gives joy. He relaxed fully, explained moves to us in easy conversation during the early intervals, lighted a cigarette carelessly, and glanced at the board for a minute, only when it came his turn to play. Each time, it seemed as if he had expected just the move that his antagonist made. The perfunctory moves came off quite rapidly. It was not until the 7th or 8th that something like a definite plan seemed to develop. Czentovic prolonged his periods of reflection, By that, we sensed that the actual battle for the lead was setting in. But, to be quite frank, the gradual development of the situation represented to us lay observers, as usually in tournament games, something of a disappointment. The more the pieces wove themselves into a singular design, the more impenetrable became the real lie of the land. We could not discern what one or the other rival purposed, or which of the two had the advantage. We noticed merely that certain pieces insinuated themselves forward, like levers to undermine the enemy front. But since every move of these superior players was part of a combination that comprised a plan for several moves ahead, we were unable to detect the strategy of their back and forth. An oppressive fatigue took possession of us, largely because of Czentovic's interminable cogitation between moves, which eventually produced visible irritation in our friend too. I observed uneasily how, the longer the game stretched out, he became increasingly restless. Moving about in his chair, nervously lighting a succession of cigarettes, occasionally seizing a pencil to make a note, he would order mineral water and gulp it down, glass after glass. It was plain that his mind was working 100 times faster than Czentovic's. Every time the latter, after endless reflection, decided to push a piece forward with his heavy hand, our friend would smile, like one who encounters something long expected, and make an immediate riposte. In his nimble mind, he must have calculated every possibility that lay open to his opponent. The longer Czentovic took to make a decision, the more his impatience grew, and during the waiting, his lips narrowed into an angry and almost inimical line. Czentovic, however, did not allow himself to be hurried. He deliberated, stiff and silent, and increased the length of the pauses, the more the field became denuded of figures. By the 42nd move, after 1.5 hours, we sat limply by, almost indifferent to what was going on in the arena. One of the ship's officers had already departed. Another was reading a book and would look up only when a piece had been moved. Then suddenly, at a move of Czentovic's, the unexpected happened. As soon as Dr. B perceived that Czentovic took hold of the bishop to move it, he crouched like a cat about to spring. His whole body trembled, and Czentovic had no sooner executed his intention than he pushed his queen forward and said, loudly and triumphantly, "There, that's done with." He fell back in his chair, his arms crossed over his breast, and looked challengingly at Czentovic. As he spoke, his pupils gleamed with a hot light. Impulsively, we bent over the board to figure out the significance of the move so ostentatiously announced. At first blush, no direct threat was observable. Our friend's statement, then, had reference to some development that we short-thoughted amateurs could not prefigure. Czentovic was the only one among us who had not stirred at the provocative call. He remained as still as if the insulting "done with" had glanced off him unheard. Nothing happened. Everybody held his breath. And at once, the ticking of the clock that stood on the table to measure the moves became audible. 3 minutes passed. 7 minutes. 8 minutes. Czentovic was motionless. But I thought I noticed an inner tension that became manifest in the greater distension of his thick nostrils. This silent waiting seemed to be as unbearable to our friend as to us. He shoved his chair back, rose abruptly, and began to traverse the smoking room, first slowly, then quicker and quicker. Those present looked at him wonderingly, but none with greater uneasiness than I, for I perceived that in spite of his vehemence, this pacing never deviated from a uniform span. It was as if, in this awful space, he would each time come plump against an invisible cupboard that obliged him to reverse his steps. Shuddering, I recognized that it was an unconscious reproduction of the pacing in his erstwhile cell. During those months of incarceration, It must have been exactly thus that he rushed to and fro like a caged animal. His hands must have been clenched and his shoulders hunched, exactly like this. It must have been like this that he pelted forward and back 1,000 times there. The red lights of madness in his paralyzed, though feverish, stare. Yet his mental control seemed still fully intact. For from time to time, he turned impatiently toward the table to see if Czentovic had made up his mind. But time stretched to 9, then 10 minutes. What occurred then, at last, was something that none could have predicted. Czentovic slowly raised his heavy hand, which until then had rested inert on the table. Tautly, we all watched for the upshot. Czentovic, however, moved no piece, but instead, with the back of his hand, pushed with one slow, determined sweep. All the figures from the board. It took us a moment to comprehend he gave up the game. He had capitulated in order that we might not witness his being mated. The impossible had come to pass. The champion of the world, victor at innumerable tournaments, had struck his colors before an unknown man who hadn't touched a chessboard for 20 or 25 years. Our friend, the anonymous, the ignotus, had overcome the greatest chess master on earth in open battle. Automatically, in the excitement, one after another rose to his feet. Each was animated by the feeling that he must give vent to the joyous shock by saying or doing something. Only one remained stolidly at rest: Czentovic. After a measured interval, he lifted his head and directed a stony look at our friend. "Another game?" he asked. "Naturally," answered Dr. B with an enthusiasm that was disturbing to me. And he seated himself, even before I could remind him of his own stipulation to play only once, and began to set up the figures in feverish haste. He pushed them about in such heat that a pawn twice slid from his trembling fingers to the floor. The pained discomfort that his unnatural excitement had already produced in me grew to something like fear, for this previously calm and quiet person had become visibly exalted. The twitching of his mouth was more frequent, and in every limb he shook, as with fever. "Don't," I said softly to him. "No more now. You've had enough for today. It's too much of a strain for you." "Strain? Ha!" And he laughed loudly and spitefully. "I could have played 17 games during that slow ride. The only strain is for me to keep awake. Well, aren't you ever going to begin?" These last words had been addressed in an impetuous, almost rude tone to Czentovic. The latter glanced at him quietly and evenly. But there was something of a clenched fist in that adamantine, stubborn glance. On the instant, a new element had entered, a dangerous tension, a passionate hate. No longer were they two players in a sporting way. They were two enemies, sworn to destroy each other. Czentovic hesitated long before making the first move, and I had a definite sensation that he was delaying on purpose. No question but that this seasoned tactician had long since discovered that just such dilatoriness wearied and irritated his antagonist. He used no less than 4 minutes for the normal, the simplest of openings, moving the king's pawn 2 spaces. Instantly, our friend advanced his king's pawn. But again, Czentovic was responsible for an eternal, intolerable pause. It was like waiting with beating heart for the thunderclap, after a streak of fiery lightning, and waiting, with no thunder forthcoming. Czentovic never stirred. He meditated quietly, slowly, and, as I felt, increasingly maliciously slowly, which gave me plenty of time to observe Dr. B. He had just about consumed his 3rd glass of water. It came to my mind that he had spoken of his feverish thirst in his cell. Every symptom of abnormal excitement was plainly present. I saw his forehead grow moist, and the scar on his hand become redder and more sharply outlined. Still, however, he held himself in rein. It was not until the fourth move, when Czentovic again pondered, exasperatingly, that he forgot himself and exploded with, "Aren't you ever going to move?" Czentovic looked up coldly. As I remember it, we agreed on a 10-minute limit. It is a principle with me not to make it less. Dr. B bit his lips. I noticed under the table the growing restlessness with which he lifted and lowered the sole of his shoe, and I could not control the nervousness that overcame me, because of the oppressive prescience of some insane thing that was boiling in him. As a matter of fact, there was a second encounter at the 8th move. Dr. B, whose self-control diminished with the increasing periods of waiting, could no longer conceal his tension. He was restless in his seat, and unconsciously began to drum on the table with his fingers. Again, Czentovic raised his peasant head. "May I ask you not to drum? It disturbs me. I can't play with that going on." "Ha ha," answered Dr. B with a short laugh. "One can see that." Czentovic flushed. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, sharply and evilly. Dr. B gave another curt and spiteful laugh. "Nothing, except that it's plain that you're nervous." Czentovic lowered his head and said nothing. 7 minutes elapsed before he made his move. And that was the funereal tempo at which the game dragged on. Czentovic became correspondingly stonier. In the end, he utilized the maximum time before determining on a move. And from interval to interval, the conduct of our friend became stranger and stranger. It appeared as if he no longer had any interest in the game, but was occupied with something quite different. He abandoned his excited pacing and remained seated, motionlessly, staring into the void with a vacant and almost insane look. He uninterruptedly muttered unintelligible words. Either he was absorbed in endless combinations, or, and this was my inner suspicion, he was working out quite other games. For each time that Czentovic got to the point of making a move, he had to be recalled from his absent state. Then it took a minute or two to orient himself. My conviction grew that he had really forgotten all about Czentovic and the rest of us, in this cold aspect of his insanity, which might at any instant discharge itself violently. Surely enough, at the 19th move, the crisis came. No sooner had Czentovic executed his play than Dr. B, giving no more than a cursory look at the board, suddenly pushed his bishop 3 spaces forward and shouted, so loudly that we all started, "Check! Check! The king!" Every eye was on the board, in anticipation of an extraordinary move. Then, after a minute, there was an unexpected development. Very slowly, Czentovic tilted his head and looked, which he had never done before, from one face to another. Something seemed to afford him a rich enjoyment, for little by little, his lips gave expression to a satisfied and scornful smile. Only after he had savored to the full the triumph which was still unintelligible to us did he address us, saying with mock deference, "Sorry, but I see no check. Perhaps one of you gentlemen can see my king in check?" We looked at the board. And then, uneasily, over at Dr. B, Czentovic's king was fully covered against the bishop by a pawn. A child could see that. Thus, the king could not possibly be in check. We turned, one to the other. Might not our friend, in his agitation, have pushed a piece over the line? A square too far, one way or the other? his attention arrested by our silence, Doctor. B now stared at the board and began, stutteringly, "But the king ought to be on f7. That's wrong, all wrong. Your move was wrong. All the pieces are misplaced. The pawn should be on g5 and not on g4. Why, that's quite a different game. That's..." He halted abruptly. I had seized his arm roughly. Or rather, I had pinched it so hard that even in his feverish bewilderment, he could not but feel my grip. He turned and looked at me like a somnambulist. What do you want?" I only said, "Remember?" At the same time, lightly drawing my finger over the scar on his hand. Automatically, he followed my gesture, his eyes fixed glassily on the blood-red streak. Suddenly, he began to tremble, and his body shook. "For God's sake," he whispered with pale lips, "have I said or done something silly? Is it possible that I'm again—" "No," I said in a low voice, "but you have to stop the game at once. It's high time. Recollect what the doctor said." With a single movement, Dr. B was on his feet. "I have to apologize for my stupid mistake," he said in his old, polite voice, inclining himself to Czentovic. "What I said was plain nonsense, of course. It goes without saying that the game is yours." Then to us, "My apologies to you, gentlemen, also. But I warned you beforehand not to expect too much from me. Forgive the disgrace. It is the last time that I yield to the temptation of chess." He bowed and left, in the same modest and mysterious manner in which he had first appeared before us. I alone knew why this man would never again touch a chessboard, while the others, a bit confused, stood around with that vague feeling of having narrowly escaped something uncomfortable and dangerous. "Damned fool," McIver grumbled in his disappointment. Last of all, Czentovic rose from his chair, half glancing at the unfinished game. "Too bad," he said generously. "The attack wasn't at all badly conceived. The man certainly has lots of talent for an amateur."